Welcome back to another episode of Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Sebastian Lebrec. If you're a loyal listener of the show, you may remember that I hosted a special podcast series on artificial intelligence last year. We discussed many topics during these episodes, but one of the themes that kept coming back was the impacts of AI on people. Will workers have to learn AI tools in the workplace? If so, how do they even begin to learn these tools? Or will some workers simply be replaced by AI, full stop? Well, concerns around individuals being left behind because of an emerging technology, it's been around for a long time. It's sometimes referred to as the digital divide. Beyond AI, you might also recall that I recorded episodes on blockchain and the Internet of Things last season. So, with all these technologies being increasingly visible in our professional and personal lives, I wanted to revisit the theme of the digital divide. Joining me today to discuss this topic is Faun Rice, who's a manager, research and evaluation at the Information and Communications Technology Council, or ICTC for short. In my past government life, I actually worked on the digital divide with ICTC, so this feels like a bit of a full circle moment for me, to be honest. It'll be great to catch up with ICTC again. Welcome to the podcast, Faun. Some of our listeners may not be as familiar with ICTC and its activities, so what should they know about ICTC?
So ICTC, or the Information and Communications Technology Council, is a national nonprofit. We've been around for about 30 years, and we're dedicated to workforce development and digital skills education. So we do K-12 programming, post-secondary education, and mid-career education. We also have some programs for newcomers who are trying to make their first entryway into the Canadian IT sector, all focused on digital skills training. We also serve small and medium-sized enterprises in Canada through wage subsidies to bring on co-op students and through digital adoption education. And then finally, we have a labor market research team that informs our programs, and that's the team that I belong to.
So the title of today's episode is The Impacts of Emerging Technologies on the Digital Divide. So very briefly, I'd like to clarify, what do we mean by digital divide? Is it the same thing as other terms we hear like digital literacy, digital skills? How do you paint the landscape?
Great question. So the digital divide, I think about in terms of access and opportunity to use technology. So classically, of course, this includes things like broadband access, hardware access, whether you're based in an urban or rural area, what infrastructure and tools do you have at your disposal. The same could be true for small business. So I think we saw a big digital divide at the beginning of COVID, when some businesses already had e-commerce set up and others needed to really rapidly set up new systems to be able to sell at a distance. And this translated, of course, to a big advantage or disadvantage. Comparatively, I think digital literacy, though it's connected to the digital divide, is more about how much knowledge does someone have about what tools might be helpful, how quickly and easily can they adopt them. So, for example, how easy was it for that COVID restaurateur to build an e-commerce platform based on their existing knowledge and aptitudes? And then finally, digital skills, I think of as the competencies you need to effectively use technology. And when we say digital, I think we mostly mean information and communications technologies, and in particular computers. And I also think about digital skills as being tied to ICT-related occupations. So, well, I think we all need digital literacy, like to navigate online banking or government systems. You might need digital skills like appropriate code documentation if you work in software development. And then the final thing I would say, I know you said very briefly, is that if we think about digital skills as what you might need to effectively use technology, you can make an argument, I think, for bundling soft or human skills into that. So things like critical thinking, problem solving, or interpersonal communication, project management.
I am curious to hear you on whether or not there's certain groups in the population that are more likely to be impacted by the digital divide.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that in Canada, rural, remote, northern, and Indigenous communities have disparities in access, of course, to affordable high-speed internet and hardware. In addition, age is a big factor in the digital divide or digital literacy. So have you grown up with computers or not? And then if you're a business, the size and the sector of your business. And then finally, of course, not all tools are designed accessibly. So ability or language can also impact the digital divide.
So you mentioned digital divide as it pertains to both individuals and businesses. Can I get you to elaborate a little bit more as to what this looks like in the business context?
For sure. So I think a few factors can really impact the digital divide for businesses. The big one is, of course, size, impacting how much of a risk a company is able to take when they're adopting a new technology that might have a longer payback period with a high initial investment. So the next one is location. So if you're in a rural area, you might not have access to skill talent you need to adopt new technologies or the infrastructure you need, like broadband. And then the third one is sector. So, for example, in the 2022 Survey of Advanced Technology by Statistics Canada, the agricultural sector has one of the lowest adoption rates of tools like AI. And in our engagement with ag tech organizations, we hear that a lot of this has to do with local access to talent. But again, that unclear or long return on investment for farmers in an already risky industry. So I think there's a really critical role that industry associations and organizations like I'm thinking the Enterprise Machine Intelligence Learning Initiative in Manitoba, Emily, that are really dedicated to sectors like agriculture, play in de-risking and prototyping new tech for their members.
Yeah, and sometimes I think awareness or lack thereof also plays a big role as well. So shifting gear a little bit, you mentioned age as a component or as one of the factors that can influence digital divide, but it's interesting because when it comes to younger people and students, we often think of them as tech savvy, right? Or the other term we sometimes use is digitally native. But that's a bit of an oversimplification. So, can you tell us about ICTC's work to help students and early career professionals develop the right skills for the digital economy?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a great point. We think about Gen Alpha and Gen Z as the always online generation, but it's a bit more complicated than that. And so I'd like to give you the example of an ICTC program called Cyber Titan, which is a national cybersecurity competition for middle and high school students. We've been running it for about 7 years, and over 5,000 Canadian students have been Cyber Titans. So teachers coach high school and middle school teams across Canada, and they all get together at the end of the year for a national competition. And ICTC does some train-the-trainer work, and we administer a curriculum from the US sister program, Cyber Patriot. Cyber Titan really serves Generation Alpha and Gen Z. And yeah, we think of them as digital natives, but they're really used to mobile devices. So a different question is, can they take things apart? Do they know how they work? Or are they really used to tools with really high quality user interfaces? And of course, cybersecurity requires a lot more of that kind of, can you take it apart? How does it work thinking? The other thing we find is that schools don't always have the tools they need to support cybersecurity education. So schools across Canada rely a lot on hardware from programs like Computers for Schools, which of course is administered by Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. And again, a big reason for that is personal devices that Gen Z, Gen Alpha have are more likely to be mobile devices. And then kind of moving up into that post-secondary age, so still Gen Z, but also millennials, we see that employers really want more professional skills from these generations. And that's one reason why we bet heavily on work integrated learning programming. So again, sticking with cybersecurity, we have a program called Cybersecurity Training and Work Integrated Learning, which is for women and non-binary post-secondary students interested in cybersecurity careers. And they go through a work integrated learning placement, as well as Microsoft certifications and a mentorship program. And the biggest kind of purpose of this program is to get them exposure to those workplaces, build confidence in cybersecurity, but also build some of those human and professional skills. And in cybersecurity, a big problem we see is that even for junior level roles, you need a lot of specialization, you need a lot of experience. And being a really junior person, being a young student, it's hard to get that first set of experiences. And that's why we think work integrated learning and co-op programs can really help.
So we've gone the entire podcast without talking about artificial intelligence. So let's talk about AI. We had a bunch of podcasts last season on AI in a different context. So you work quite a bit with job posting data as it pertains to the digital economy. So I'm curious to hear you on this. Are you noticing an increase in the number of employers requiring AI or AI adjacent skills? It feels like AI is all the buzz, but does that materialize to the labor market?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So we do have some research that's seeking to answer that question that's going to come out in March. So I don't want to spoil the punchline entirely, especially because we're still working on it. But we have a project right now that's trying to understand the impact of artificial intelligence productivity tools like coding assistants on demand for, again, those junior talent, those entry-level folks in core digital economy roles. So things like programmers, software developers, and whether or not AI is changing the skills they need for their first jobs. So stay tuned for that study. But I think we do see an increase in the term AI in job posts. I can say for sure, like for the core digital economy jobs that we track in our labor market data, we're seeing the term AI come up in over 10% of those job posts right now. And I think an interesting question is what that really means. Like, what do employers mean when they put AI as a skill in a job post? And I would suggest that from some of our industry engagement, when it comes to these core digital economy occupations, employers want people to be experimenting with these tools in a way that will boost their productivity. So not necessarily can they build an AI tool, can they train a model? More, are they able to use something like Copilot to help them write better code? Are they able to employ these tools in writing and other things that boost their productivity? So even though AI sounds really sexy right now, I think that a lot of the time employers are adding it to job posts just like they're adding, should be able to use Microsoft Office Suite. So can you use this tool to enhance your other existing skills?
Employers and businesses listening to this episode, it's actually a great key takeaway, because if you're not careful in how you frame this requirement in a job posting, it might be interpreted in the wrong way. I can definitely imagine a scenario where, knowledge of AI, some candidates will read that to mean, training a large language model, and then someone else will read this to mean being able to use ChatGPT. So I think that's those are some powerful words of wisdom for employers. So a key takeaway from today's conversation is that it takes an entire ecosystem to tackle the digital divide and ensure that workers have the right skills for the digital economy. ICTC is obviously a big part of this ecosystem, but I'm kind of curious to hear you on the integration of the different players. It just feels like, there's so many moving pieces. You have employers, you have the school system, you have organizations like ICTC, you have other non-for-profits. So what can you tell us about how everybody is working together or should be working together?
Yeah, I think when we think about skills training, we go right away to high schools and post-secondaries. And of course, traditional education plays a really important role in digital literacy and building these skills. And we can support that through initiatives like I've talked about in terms of making sure all schools have the right access to hardware and that we are preparing teachers to be ready to deliver those digital skills. Because of course, there's a generational gap between, us millennials plus trying to teach digital literacy in the classroom and these always online generations. In addition, post-secondary institutions, I think, play a really important role in universities in introducing people to a wide variety of fields and building holistic people with a lot of those kind of soft and human skills that we've talked about. But I think it's really important for industry to get involved through models like work integrated learning, because not all post-secondaries can compete with the private sector to pay people who have these up-to-date skills. And of course, we know there's a lot of salary competition in tech, and it's just not necessarily feasible to expect post-secondaries to be able to recruit and retain that level of staff. So that's where industry PSI partnerships can be really crucial. And I think we're really seeing that type of innovation from a lot of post-secondary institutions, not just through work integrated learning, but other types of ways to bring industry into the classroom. Colleges have been doing this, for a long time through their program advisory committees and making sure that industry is informing curriculum. And then I do think we still need employers to invest in workforce development through co-ops, through apprenticeship models. And then government, civil society, I think, play a key role in helping de-risk that for the private sector, because we know there's so many small employers in Canada. It can take a lot of work and time to mentor a student, and things like salary subsidies, which right now are provided primarily through organizations like MyTax, so civil society, but also the Government of Canada's Student Work Placement Program, the SWIP program, which offers a 50 to 70% wage subsidy for co-op students in particular sectors. That plays a really critical role in helping industry feel ready to come to the table. And we hear from employers that a lot of them wouldn't be able to take on a student if it weren't for that wage subsidy that helps, again, de-risk some of that time and investment.
It's interesting you mention the PSI industry partnerships, because another thing that it's important to think about is that throughout someone's career, the digital skills will kind of evolve, right? I think 10 years ago, if you would have told someone, hey, you'll need to use this tool that will generate some text for you out of a token system, that person would have been like, that sounds like a movie. But here it is today, and you have people that have to learn how to use this, and it seems like partnerships is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, something like GitHub Copilot, right, for coding assistance is new enough on the scene that I think even the private sector is competing for talent that can help them adopt these types of tools. So how do we expect post-secondaries to compete for the same pool of people? I think having industry PSI partnerships is really the only way forward with rapidly changing, rapidly adapting, and rapidly innovating, uses of these technologies.
So with rapid change comes obviously the possibility that blind spots emerge. So I'd be curious to hear you on this specific dimension. Are there any blind spots that you believe the ecosystem should pay more attention to?
Yes, great question. So I've been talking a lot about information and communications technology occupations or digital economy occupations. And in these types of jobs, we do see perpetual underrepresentation of equity deserving communities, including women, Black people, Indigenous peoples, people of color, et cetera. So I think that a critical blind spot for the tech sector is thinking that there is a one size fits all approach to workforce development and helping junior talent get into those entry level roles. And I can give you an example. A couple of years ago, we did an evaluation of the Student Work Placement Program, which is the federal program for wage subsidies for co-op students that I was talking about. And in that, we did a really extensive literature review to understand what has been really successful or not successful about work integrated learning in the past. And one of the things that studies have found is that work integrated learning works really well in terms of building confidence, adaptability, again, those professional skills, but can inadvertently cause harm for equity deserving students if they're in workplaces that lack cultural safety or that aren't providing the right supports. And so I think that's a really important example of where a one-size-fits-all approach to something like work integrated learning or workforce development really needs careful design, inclusive design from participants who have been through it and are from a diversity of communities to make sure that we're not inadvertently enhancing barriers to access those occupations for groups that are already underrepresented.
I think that's such a tremendous point. And I think in addition to that, it's also really important for people to realize that there's tech innovation and tech partnerships happening across Canada among all group. And there's so many cool things happening when it comes to entrepreneurs from equity deserving groups, providing great opportunities and developing great businesses in the tech sector. For instance, I was reading in Betakit of this great organization called the Indigenous Tech Circle, and it brings together a community of 340 Indigenous tech leaders, founders, and professionals. And I think it's important to realize that the tech community is not homogeneous, and this is what makes it so great.
Absolutely. And if I can just give props to a program that I think is doing a really great job of this. I've been talking a ton about apprenticeship models, co-op models. Out of Employment and Social Development Canada, there's a program called the Information Technology Apprenticeship for Indigenous Peoples. And this is a 2-year program where the Government of Canada hires folks working from their communities in a paid 2-year apprenticeship program where they're doing kind of entry-level work that qualifies for the Government of Canada's entry-level IT classification. And they're also doing kind of 20% digital skills training, ICT training. And then when they graduate at the end, they graduate with the competency equivalent of that entry-level role, so they can be hired into any Government of Canada department in an IT role. And the program is designed to allow folks to enter based on kind of passion and interest and curiosity in IT and not necessarily needing an undergraduate degree. So they've had some really amazing preliminary outcomes, and I definitely encourage everyone to look up their work.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Faun, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. I was really excited about this conversation. As I mentioned in previous episodes, we looked at different technologies We looked at AI, we looked at crypto, we looked at IoT. So talking about the digital divide, digital skills aspect of all of this was very, very timely. So thank you so much. And as always, we do encourage our listeners to check out the website of our guests. So how can they check out the work that you guys are doing?
Our main website is www.ictc-ctic.ca. And there you can find our research reports as well as relevant news and events. And then if you're interested in any of our programs, for example, if you are a job seeker looking for labor market information or interested in applying to one of the programs I've talked about today, or if you're an employer interested in getting subsidy funding for a co-op student, you would find all of that information at the website etalentcanada.ca.
That's great. I think there'll definitely be some listeners that will reach out now that they know about the different programs and the opportunity to use a word that we used a lot today, to partner with you guys. So thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences. The views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights for this episode are reserved, and the guests on the Intended Consequences podcast might be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the work of the Institute and to subscribe to our newsletter, visit our website at strategycorp.com/institute and make sure to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm Sebastian Lebrac, and I intend to talk to you again next episode.